Hi, Jamie with you again. I hope you're very well indeed. Thanks for joining me on Talking Sonics. Now, my last video was talking about how to record vocals without headphones and talking about phase cancellation, and there was a good comment from someone who was basically asking, what do I mean? What is phase? Well, a good question is also, what is phase relationship compared to flipping phase or flipping polarity, which is ultimately flipping the polarity of the wires inside a mixing console. It can also be done with digital plugins, but that is actually ultimately turning the audio waveform upside down when you flip the polarity. So what is phase, or what is phase relationship? Well, let's take this, or try and make this as simple as possible, because it is a very, very complex subject. So the concept of what is a phase relationship. Well, let's have a think about sound coming from a single source into, say, a single recording microphone. I can think about recording guitars is a good example. If you put one microphone very close to a guitar speaker cabinet like an SM57, and straight up the guts, you are very close to that source of that sound. So no phase issues. It's just a single source you're recording. But let's say, for example, you have a very close microphone and then something like this, a condenser microphone further away, perhaps adding a bit of, or recording a bit of room ambience. It's actually technically further away, so the sound wave continuing to hit that diaphragm of the second microphone is further away than the close source. So if you blend those two sources, the close microphone and the further away microphone, in your audio mix or in your song, so there will be a drift in phase. So if you looked at a graph of these two audio sources, maybe like this, it will show you just how there's that phase drift from one source to another. So what does it mean for us to be thinking about phase in recording? Well, obviously, if you've got multiple microphone sources and there's different time alignments and microphones are doing different things, or maybe there's a top snare drum mic and a bottom snare drum mic picking up the sizzle from the bottom of the snare, you may find that you need to flip phase polarity. You may need to do that. You can do that on the console. If you've got an old desk like this, or a Neve, or a very good Class A mic pre, you usually have the phase flip polarity symbol. Otherwise, you might want to be really studying and looking at mic placements and getting into some theory or some other people's advice. For example, there's some videos out there on mic techniques for drums. One in particular I've used recently, the Glyn Johns, which is a British engineer, a very fantastic engineer, who incidentally, while British, recorded one of the best, or engineered one of the best Australian bands, Midnight Oil, Place Without a Postcard album. And look, this concept of his for recording drums involves 4 microphones. I believe it's an overhead right above the kit or above the snare drum, one off to the side, a little far away from the floor drum or the floor tom side, and also a kick drum and snare mic. 4 microphones, so really limiting any possibility of phase drift or phase cancellation. But the key room mics here are the overhead microphone and the microphone which is sort of off to the side in this particular microphone concept, picking up the floor tom and a bit of the ride cymbal, but not too close to it, still aiming at the snare drum a little high, so the sonics from the snare drum can aim at that microphone to the side as well. And the key with this was using a tape to measure the same, I think it was like almost 2.5 sticks lengths up and across to these mics. So ultimately the 2 room mics rather than the close mics were time aligned to the snare drum, so the snare being the key source in phase alignment. Where else will we think about phase shift? Well, I'm thinking about bats. Why am I thinking about bats? Well, strange one. I was going for a bit of a run around my forest here in Victoria, Australia, where I live, and thinking about this, and thinking about the fact that when we record ambience in a room, we're deliberately looking for room reflections to get some natural reverb. And ultimately this means that the sound source, whether that be the guitar amplifier or the drum kit, sound is coming from that source and then hitting the walls, the ceiling, and bouncing back to whatever that room mic is that you're using. So we're deliberately recording reflections, which is ultimately many misaligned or misphase aligned reflections of sound building together to create a new kind of dynamic, distant sound, I guess. And it made me think about bats. I mean, bats doing their kind of beep noise radar thing where they fly around and make that little beep noise. If you know what bats do, if you've lived in the country and you can hear them flying at night, they can hear this, these reflections and learn about their environment. So obviously bad eyesight, but great ears, and they can detect the different ambience or the where the reflections are coming from. So I think perhaps if bats were audio engineers, maybe they would be some of the best at phase time alignment. It made me also think about Stevie Wonder. Could he possibly be one of the best musicians and perhaps even audio engineers for hearing phase alignment? Does he get in a studio with someone and say, hey man, top and bottom snare drum mics are completely out of phase and there's something wrong with your room mic positioning? So I don't know, maybe he's a bit like this. I assume that if you lose your eyesight, the ears are going to increase in terms of knowledge, and that's the way the brain works. So phase, listening for phase and listening for misaligned phase is something that's no doubt very complicated. You need to learn to hear it and to understand it. It takes a lot of experience. If you're a new musician or a new recording engineer recording your own stuff or recording other bands, think about single source. Try and keep things simple. If it's one SM57 microphone on a guitar amp, use that. If you're going to use a DI on a bass, just use the DI on the bass. If you want to use the DI on the bass and also a microphone on the bass amplifier to get some of that sort of distorted thump from the amp, beware, you may need to flip the phase on that amp mic or the DI when you blend the two. Listen for a sort of a loss in bottom end. You may lose that 100 hertz punch from the bass guitar when you blend the DI and the microphone sound together. So be very cautious, but when in doubt, keep things simple. And the beauty of less microphones ultimately means less phase issues or less possibility of phase issues. So keep things very, very simple. That's my advice. Thanks for joining me. Hopefully that kind of answers something a little bit about phase. Don't know why I was going on about bats there. Obviously bats on my mind post-coronavirus. I hope you're all very well and safe and surviving out there in the world. Scary times that we've been through. Stay well. Thanks for joining me on Talking Sonics. Click the bell. Subscribe, please. And if you've got any questions, feel free to chat to me. I'm here 24/7 to answer any queries you may have. And if you have any other questions, please join me and ask away. Thanks for your time. See you soon.